course, considering environmental impacts. When I was a kid, air quality in the United States was dramatically worse than it is today. My entire lifetime, we've seen a massive increase in air quality in the U.S. That's fantastic. That's to be celebrated. Today, the policies that get in the way of reasonable energy development and mess up the math are things focused around climate change. We've done almost nothing to change global greenhouse gas emissions, as close to nothing as you can get from endless regulations on electricity that have just driven up prices and driven down reliability in the name of climate change. This impacts American lives dramatically. That's why President Trump was elected. President Trump got elected to bring the focus back to humans about energy, about math, about facts, not silly and, again, unfortunately, innumerate climate politics. So we've just gone through a dramatic wet winter event. Cold air mass came down over the eastern, more than half of the United States. To give an example of the magnitude of this storm, we had reported just yesterday, every week we report the draws out of natural gas from storage. The largest natural gas storage withdrawal ever reported. That's a symbol of what increased energy demand came with this storm. What is natural gas? It's the largest source of home heating for Americans in the country. It's the largest source of electricity generation in the United States. Of course, we produce fertilizer with it and chemicals and run industry with it as well, but those are less impacted by weather. But heating and electricity demand are driven by weather. You get a cold storm. This was a big cold storm. We had a smaller but also intense cold storm 5 years ago, Winter Storm Uri in Texas, that became famous because it collapsed the Texas electricity grid, led to over 200 deaths, and 4.5 million people lost access to electricity. That's a grid that had lost its way and had a huge impact. This is a much larger storm, a much more dramatic impact. Less than 1 million people lost access to electricity. We wish that was zero. We work and strategize and talk every day about how to reduce that number. And the nearly million that did lose access to electricity in this case did not lose it because generation failed, that we were not able to supply the capacity for the grid. They almost entirely came from icing on local distribution lines that took poles and lines down. My colleagues that are sitting in the front here, and one of them you'll hear from here in a second, worked 7 days a week in rotating shift, 24 hours a day to move workers to get lines back up as much as possible. I think roughly 98% has been restored that lost electricity. That is a heroic effort of tens of thousands of Americans traveling across the country to help, and our team here that just coordinated through the night, through the day. And as my Deputy Secretary will walk you through, the unique and different policies the Trump administration brought with this focus on humans. We're going to do things that haven't been done before but should have done before, and we did here. I'm going to start with the big picture on just generation, because this is what gets talked about politically. This is what gets voted. This is what gets put into policy. Then James is going to talk about, Deputy Secretary James Stanley is going to talk about how did we actually manage the crisis during the storm and the great cooperation we got, I think, across 22 states to deal with this thing. But this is, when you design an electricity grid, there's two major criteria. One is you must keep the lights on and the heats running or people die. Hospitals shut down, factories close. This is an enormous asset of a modern society to have an electricity grid. You must design it for peak demand. As we sit here today, there's hundreds of gigawatts of excess generating capacity. We're not stressing the electricity grid right now. Certainly in the western United States, we're not stressing it at all. So when I hear politicians say, we just need more electrons on the grid, no, we don't. No, we don't. It's the middle of a day and the weather's mild. When the sun shines or the wind blows, it doesn't add anything to the capacity of our electricity grid. It just means we send subsidy checks to those generators and we tell the other generators turn down because we're mailing subsidy checks to these generators. If you want to add to the capacity of our electricity grid, enable data centers, enable us to reshore manufacturing, the only way you do that that's helpful is you have to add to our peak generating dispatchability at that peak demand time, and we don't know when it's going to be. If you can add reliable power at peak demand time, you're additive to the grid. If you can't, you're just a cost center. You're not actually helpful for the grid. So here is, and this is zooming in on peak demand time. We took the peak demand time, which was different in New England and the mid-Atlantic states than it was whatever, but we took all of those moments, those hours of peak demand time, and said who was there, who kept the lights on, who delivered at that peak demand time. And I'll walk across this calendar, and then we compared it to what was that same source doing 365 days ago at that point in time. What does that source typically do? So what you see in this is when peak demand goes up, you got to produce more electricity than normal. Natural gas increased its electric generation at that peak demand time 47% higher than it was a year ago at that same time in the wintertime. So it still had a high demand there, but it flexed up 47%. Of course, it also flexed up dramatically for home heating at that time. This is an energy source that's there when you need it. Coal generation increased 25% at peak demand time from where it was a year ago. And think of those efforts. We're shutting down coal plant. Coal electricity is all in the decline. It's 25% higher than it was last year because we needed it to be there. Nuclear steady eddy. It works whether the rains, the wind's blowing, the sun's shining, whatever, it drives through it. But it delivered basically the same amount of electricity as it did last year because it's hard to flex nuclear plants. I wish we could flex them up, but fantastic that it's steady. We know it's going to be there, whether peak demand time is when it's hot in the summertime or very cold in the morning or very cold in the evening when everyone comes home. It's going to be there for us. The sources that are so touted and so we hear about constantly, wind generation. Of course, we have enormous installed wind capacity across the country right now. Wind at peak demand time. This is averaged across the regions. I'll zoom into a region or two here in a second. Wind produced 40% less electricity when we needed it most. This is actually an overperformance of wind compared to that winter storm Uri 5 years ago that came down in a high pressure system, sat there, wind power collapsed by 60 or 70%. This was a storm that had precipitation. It had a low pressure system, so we had moving air. So that's very disappointing that we lost 40% of our capacity. It's done worse in most high pressure systems in the summer and the winter. Hydro and geo are reasonably stable and reliable. Solar is pretty meaningless in the winter, whether you have a storm or not. So massive solar capacity across the United States, not a meaningful amount of electricity generated during the storm, and not a meaningful amount of electricity generated last winter at the same time. It's not an all-weather power source. To just look at the generation. When I read these articles, well, we're going to put in, 5 gigawatts of new solar. That does not mean you get 5 gigawatts of power generation as you might with a nuclear reactor or a gas plant or a coal plant. In fact, if you looked averaged across all the regions, if we looked at the capacity of solar, how much did it actually deliver relative to its capacity? If you had 1 gigawatt, you got 110 megawatts from solar when we needed it most. Again, this was a storm with precipitation and low pressure systems, so we did have wind. Wind only under-delivered by 77% relative to its capacity. So just another thing of saying when you read these, it's going to supply 300,000 homes in New England. Like, nonsense. Capacity factors don't matter. It's what do you deliver when we need it. So where did we get electricity? For all of the, this is the data like I showed in the first pie, but just given into market shares. If I took the peak demand time in Florida, the peak demand time in the Southeast, the peak demand time in PJM, the peak demand time in New England, they were at different times in different places, and just averaged across all those regions, where did that electricity come from? Natural gas, again, it's the workhorse of America's grid, pretty much 24/7, but it grew its market share even though demand was higher. Coal, look at coal, 24% of U.S. electricity, 15% from nuclear. If you look at where do we get electricity from last year, averaged over the whole year, you'll see natural gas is 1, nuclear is 2, coal is 3, or some people will say wind. Wind average amount of electricity is similar to coal, way higher installed capacity. But when you needed it, coal is able to ramp up and be there. So coal was 24%. Nuclear on average is about 20% of U.S. electricity. And it keeps delivering that amount of electricity, but when demand goes up, that same amount of electricity is a smaller piece of the pie. So this isn't nuclear going away, it's just the demand pie was bigger. Wind, 8%. 8%, think about that. A third of what coal delivered, despite massively more installed capacity, massively more money invested in wind generation, transmission, hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies. Hydro and geothermal, these are pretty steady energy sources as well. They're not at huge scale right there, 4%. Solar, 2%, and other, which is, think of this as solar and batteries. This is wood, refuse, oil. This is all the other sources of electricity generation. But if you look at that, oil's here. What kept the lights on? Nuclear, natural gas, and coal. Let's look at New England. New England, again, very cold in New England. Very cold in Florida. Keeping the lights on and heating working is just critical for humans. This is at peak demand time in New England. First thing I'll point out was, what was the largest source of electricity generation at the time where it matters, at peak demand time? Oil was number 1. This is crazy. Oil was a huge source of electricity generation in the United States when my mom was in high school. That's when we used a lot of oil for electricity generation. Oil is the largest global source of energy, but it's much more expensive than coal and natural gas. So with time, the use of oil is shrinking into the things you have to have oil for, and it's displaced by cheaper energy sources. But in New England, just bad policies, bad politics around energy has made it so that they don't have enough capacity to bring natural gas in when it matters at peak demand times. So these plants that can run on natural gas have to be dual fuel plants. So when it gets really cold, all the pipeline capacity is filled coming into New England. You first have to deliver natural gas for home heating. That's even more dangerous than using your electricity. In a lot of places in the South, home heating is electricity. But so it gets diverted to home heating, and that's the amount of natural gas left to generate electricity, not enough. The Constitution pipeline, you've heard me talk about for a year. We need to build the Constitution pipeline. This should not happen. Natural gas would have easily filled all of that electricity as well, but we couldn't get it to market. This oil is massively more expensive. It burns dirtier. You have to deliver it by barge and then trucks. We're trying to arrange barges and trucks to deliver heating oil to all these power plants. We do this in Hawaii and in Puerto Rico and in the America of my mom. We shouldn't be doing this in New England. This is simply bad political decision to block a pipeline to bring lower cost, cleaner burning natural gas to New England. Nuclear was again reliable, continued to deliver. Hydro, this coming from Canada. Thankfully, we had hydro generation there. And how did the darlings do? Wind, 2%. Solar, 0. Storage, when you think of batteries, they last a few hours. This is a multi-day storm, right? So wind and solar combined delivered 2% of New England electricity at the absolute most important moment. Less than burning trash and burning wood. This is the way you need to look at electricity grid, not average. Again, giving me extra electricity when I don't need it is just an extra cost. If I'm going to get all of my electricity from these sources, right, I could just run the same grid I have today, get rid of all of the wind and solar, all the transmission capacity, all the costs associated with it, and deliver the same output. The same output. When you force sources that go on vacation at peak demand, you just drive up costs. You got to run 2 grids. That's the big picture story of where we actually got energy from during this storm. the details of navigating up to these peak hours and around, and the logistics of supplying these things. In fact, we had times where our existing capacity couldn't deliver anything, and the lights would have gone out if not for emergency orders that I'm going to have my colleague and longtime partner, Deputy Secretary James Danley, who was previously chairman of FERC, a true electricity expert. We have two other true electricity experts in the front row, our Assistant Secretary for the Office of Electricity, Katie Jereza, and Alex Fitzsimmons, our acting Undersecretary for Energy. So this is the team and the people under them that worked, that literally shifts 24/7 through the storm to make sure we did everything we could to keep the lights on, to keep people alive, and deliver a dramatically better result than the much smaller Uri storm of 5 years ago. So I'll introduce Deputy Secretary James Danley.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Wright. So yes, as the Secretary mentioned, I'm the Deputy Secretary here at the Department of Energy, and I used to be the Chairman and a Commissioner at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for years. And so obviously the utility system is something that I am quite familiar with after all those years of being the head of the regulator for it. I think it's worth highlighting a handful of things, primarily the fact that President Trump's administration and Secretary Wright have returned our energy policy to one of common sense across the board. The policies of removing energy that is needed, energy sources like coal and gas, has been reversed, and we're doing everything we can to ensure as much of the dispatchable energy that Secretary Wright has been talking about for the last few minutes. You saw the chart that showed the performance of coal. That in large part was the result of administration efforts that were undertaken by the department to ensure that those coal plants remained operational through orders issued by the Secretary. The other thing to mention, again, is that the actions that we took over the storm were not just common sense, they were unprecedented. Right? We've never used, any administration has never used the statutory powers that the Secretary enjoys quite the way Secretary Wright has. So to give you an idea of the large, broad categories of the efforts we undertook, the first is what I mentioned before with the saving of dispatchable generation. We retained those dispatchable assets that were on the bulk power system that could reliably and affordably produce electricity when needed, not the fair weather friends of other generation resources, but the dependable, tried and true coal and gas. That is common sense, and that had never been done before. We made available also through secretarial orders all of the backup generation. Now it's worth noting for people that we have tens of gigawatts of backup generation at all manner of different industrial and commercial facilities across the country. In every major event like this in the past, that generation has sat idle or has been used only at the time that the bulk power system fails, as opposed to being available to the utilities as the Secretary made them available as you're getting up to scarcity times. This allowed the utilities to make full use of their thermal fleets in order to meet the demand, knowing that they had the ability to have the curtailment of those facilities by running those backup generators. It was a great idea, and it was employed in order to make sure that there was electricity sufficiency throughout the country. We also had orders that ensured that the emissions limits that generators would run up to, these are annualized emissions limits, but they are done in discrete chunks. Those emission limits were waived, right? We want to have clean air. That's an absolutely important requirement, and we run our utility system to ensure that that happens. But when you're facing an emergency like this storm, you have to have common sense, and we relieved those generators of the obligation to meet those emission standards on a temporary basis for the time that the demand was high. And then the last thing we did was a massive amount of coordination. I appreciated that Secretary Wright mentioned the 24-hour shifts. They were long days. But part of that was not merely the fact that we were getting requests for assistance from the utilities. It was also coordination with partners across the government, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Homeland Security, and really critically, the utilities and the balancing authorities. And so before the winter storm began, through the mutual assistance program run through the Electric Sector Coordinating Council, we had, I think, 65,000 utility workers ready to go and not just make repairs in their own service territories, but across the entire affected area. We had crews moving from state to state offering assistance, and this is why we went from a peak of just about 1 million outages to the last update I get them continuously, is less than 20,000. And we're working as quickly as we can to assist those people get their power back on. Those are mostly local distribution problems, and in many cases the reason why it's taken time is not because of the electric system. It's fine. It's the fact that it's difficult to get to remote locations where the lines were affected. And so that was a very rapid recovery. The bottom line here is that we managed to ensure that there was sufficient capacity. Not one area had a blackout or a forced outage due to loss of capacity. We had a gas system that worked perfectly and was one of the absolutely required critical components to keep that capacity going. And there were no major transmission failures and coordination across the board, both with government and industry. So this is a new way of doing business, and in every case there are common sense policies that ensure that we can meet the moment of these sorts of strained times of scarcity. Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Wright.
With that, we will take questions. I have a microphone over here, so just go ahead and raise your hand and be sure to state your name.
Hi, good morning, Secretary. Darren Botello, Fox Business. I just wanted to ask you about the data centers and them helping with the grid this winter. How much of an effect have they had? And then also, what's the priority with the costs of them with communities? Because obviously we're seeing an increase in them being used in the generation.
Yes, data centers is a huge issue. Number one, important for the United States to continue to lead in AI. This is a signature initiative of President Trump that America must lead in AI. But they are huge. They are growing consumers of electricity. Handled correctly, this is actually a pathway to lower electricity prices in the United States, far more than it is a pathway to raise electricity prices. Because data center load's much more uniform, right? It has a steadier usage profile. So you can build generation assets that match that. And for existing transmission lines and grid that most of the time is wildly underutilized, if you can raise the average utilization of assets, you can drive electricity prices down. Our whole department has worked with hyperscalers that in arranging these deals to make sure they bring money forward. So for upfront investments, they're providing capital for that. Often we're having them engage in deals where it freezes electricity price for a few years going forward. They are passionate about this issue as well. But in the long run, it's a good thing for our electricity generating system to have more levelized loads from data centers. And of course, this is America. We've tripled our oil production in the last 20 years. We've doubled our natural gas production. We've barely grown our capacity to generate electricity. This is why we have not reindustrialized yet. This is why we are not on the policies of the Biden and Obama administrations. We're going to have no chance to compete in the AI race. We need to bring common sense back across the whole electricity sector. Deputy Secretary Danley talked about that during the storm, but we need that more broadly. We need to grow our electricity production capacity and drive down the prices for Americans. And that's what this administration will do.
How much will they use for power generation?
We used hundreds of backup generating sites were turned on and used. I don't have a quantitative number for now, but a meaningful amount of electricity. And when you're at a tight margin, 100 megawatts is meaningful. If it's the difference between shedding load or going into blackout mode and keeping lights on. To us, it was just enough to keep it on. Florida was an area they were used a lot. Very cold weather in Florida. Most heating there, most home heating is by electricity.
Callie Pattison with the Washington Examiner. Last week, Tri-State Generation and Platte River Power Authority they filed a petition asking DOE to reconsider the order from December having their Craig Generation Stations Unit 1 remain operational through the end of March. Now, some analysts have said that having it open for this 90-day period will cost the utilities at least $20 million, and if it's extended for a year, up to $150 million. Does the department have a plan to prevent those costs from being passed on to consumers in the region?
Oh, the far larger costs come from blackouts. I got critiqued wildly for keeping the Campbell coal plant open, the first one we used at 202C Authority. We don't need it. It's going to increase costs in Michigan. That plant run full bore during this cold wave, this full storm we had. And in fact, last summer, it ran at very high utilization rates. So these plants are not being closed to lower utility costs or whatever. This is sort of the typical pushback. But honestly, the pushback is nonsense. If you look, 28 states have renewable portfolio standards. Those are the states, Colorado's one of them, those are the states that have forced the premature closure of coal plants. They have 50% higher electricity prices than the 22 states that don't do that. So as you saw from here, keeping coal plants on allows you to meet peak demand and allows you to keep price rises down. They're not a cost center. They're a security generator, and they're a cost downward driver.
Hi, Mr. Secretary. I'm Chuck McCutcheon with Axios. You talked about the relative lack of wind and solar capacity during this storm, but your administration's getting a lot of criticism from Democrats about, slow walking, or they say delaying, or, most notably offshore wind, canceling those kinds of projects. If those projects had been online, couldn't wind and solar have made a more measurable difference during this storm or in the future?
So thanks for the question. And I don't have the chart in front of me, but I remember the numbers. If we saw in New England, solar represented at peak demand time 0. So if I had 10 times more solar, I can do the math, it would be 0. And wind, let's say we had just massively more wind power, twice the capacity we had, 2% would have been 4%. So no is the answer, actually. They're just not there when they're needed. So having more, the math doesn't work. It just means more cost increase. I'll notice new Virginia Governor Spanberger just agreed to re-enter the regional greenhouse gas initiative, which is effectively a carbon tax, to make it more expensive to generate electricity from non-wind and solar assets. Where did Virginia get over 90% of its electricity during the storm? Not from wind, not from solar. So no, if you take a small number and double it, it's still a small number.
James Johnny, R2 Insider. It seems like I've covered the industry for a long time, and like the Gordian knot that they always try to cut during the winter is gas-electric coordination. So that's been an issue for multiple administrations. But like, what is the Trump administration doing to fix that, to try to work that issue out?
So it is a real question. And again, I highlighted the New England example, and there it wasn't a coordination problem. It's just a lack of pipeline capacity. We have commercial developers that will build that pipeline. Hopefully it's under construction sometime this year. But that was a near catastrophe that we should not have been near the catastrophe New England almost saw. New England could have been in a very bad place, if not what this team did, because of that severe pipeline constraint. I don't know if Alex or James want to say anything more about electricity gas coordination, but it is an area of study for us. James, you want to elaborate on that?
Just very briefly, it is a subject that we're working on. As you've been reporting for so long, you've seen the ups and downs that the efforts have had over the years. We had the council did the review of gas electric coordination and had their first report issued a couple months ago. And also the RTOs in the Northeast did their best to procure as much fuel as possible in advance and help their gas generators do that in advance of the weather. It's still ongoing. The temperatures are still cold, but we're seeing, especially in PJM, efforts to get gas out as far as possible. And that's in part with the encouragement of the department and talking with the stakeholders.
Hi, Mr. Secretary. Carlos Anchondo with E&E News. I wanted to ask you about Constitution Pipeline. They submitted a petition to FERC last in December, and they don't have any customers identified in that petition, and also the Iroquois has not submitted an application to FERC at this juncture for the Wright Interconnection Project, which is really the last stage of the Constitution Pipeline. So I'm wondering, how feasible do you think it is that the Constitution Pipeline is going to get, under construction in 2026? Do you think that that's moving forward?
Well, I think I wish it was still up here. Benny, we should throw that chart back up here to see where New England got electricity at peak demand time. So I've heard this as well from the politicians. Well, there's no customers for it. That is also just complete nonsense.
But they don't identify any customers in their petition to the agency.
Because if a pipeline has been blocked, by the governor of New York, and she says she's going to continue to block the pipeline, people wait for that politics to come out. we will have customers coming out of the woodwork. Do you want to burn far cheaper natural gas versus oil? Do you want to have cleaner air? Do you want to have data centers? Do you want to have manufacturing and lower energy costs in New England? I haven't spoken to a single resident or governor of New England that doesn't want lower energy costs, cleaner air, and more secure energy supply. So I have zero concern about the Constitution pipeline being amply subscribed to. In fact, I know plenty of people that are ready and waiting to do that. It's politics that's standing in the way of the Constitution pipeline, and I believe we will win that political battle. Can you stand up today and say, no, the answer isn't to increase our largest source of electricity generation and have it displace more expensive generating sources? It's to double down on 2% to get to 4%, or double down on 0% to stay at 0%. The economics, the environmental impacts, and the cost for New England residents are just compelling to get more natural gas into New England. The problem is not demand or customers.
If I could follow up briefly, have you spoken with Governor Hochul about Constitution pipeline?
Oh, since the day I arrived in office. And look, I think she will come around. I think she will come around to it. She's worked with us on the Nessie pipeline. I think she'll work with us on Constitution. But it's been frustratingly slow, and I think now's the time to act.
Hi, I'm Catherine Boudreau with Latitude Media. How much do you think battery storage could solve this issue of peak demand? Because we saw in Texas, for instance, like on Monday morning during Winter Storm Fern, they did I think it was like 8 gigawatts or something during that peak time period when they were really worried about grid stress. So do you think this is a pathway to like shaving off those peak demands?
So I do think there's a future for battery and battery storage in electricity grid management, because it is about shaving off peak demands. We are working in the department supporting new battery technologies, because one of the biggest problems is the batteries we use today are 2 hours and maybe 4 hours. These are multi-day storm events. And particularly when you get these high pressure systems, the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, you don't have a way to recharge the batteries. So they're not going to be a Shangri-La, but there is a role for batteries to reduce, to enhance our ability to deal with peak demand. There's a future for battery technology, particularly as it gets better and cheaper. It is important.
Thank you, Secretary. Christopher Salas, Hearst Television. So 2 questions for you. First, on data centers. Are Americans right now paying higher utility costs, in your opinion, for data centers? And could you just give an update from the administration in terms of what you're doing to try and prevent that?
So I would say in the short answer, no. Americans are not paying higher prices because of data centers. There's a perception there, and I get the perception, but it's not actually true. And I'll come out, I think, soon with some more data like this on energy, on big picture. But it's where we look at electricity prices over the last 5 years across all 50 states in the United States. And the most clear trend there, besides if you have a renewable portfolio standards, you're going to have much higher electricity prices than states that don't. But if you look at demand trends, the state with the fastest growth in demand over the last 5 years is North Dakota. Is the only state with lower nominal electricity prices, let alone below inflation. And if you look at other states with fast demand growth, they're all in the low-cost electricity markets. If you look at New York, Massachusetts, Delaware, California, and several other states, they have less demand today than they had 5 years ago. They have the highest electricity prices. I could say the same thing in England. England produces almost 30% less electricity today than they did 15 years ago. In Germany, it's over 20% less electricity. When you have reduced consumption, you get massively higher prices. So that's why I come back to that point. Data centers are actually a way to drive demand up and prices down.
Shouldn't be opposing them on the basis of cost, is what you're saying.
They should not. There's a perception there, but the perception is incorrect. I understand people seeing this big industrial development, they're concerned about it, but it is a pathway to lower prices, not higher.
Just, our viewers from Oklahoma City to Boston. Yeah, absolutely. Just one more. Is the grid ready for the next big storm? If not, what are the biggest upgrades that need to be made right now?
a lot of improvements need to be made on the grid. Also, you look at California, the massive investments in wind and solar, what did they starve? They starved the investment of maintaining the grid itself. Remember the campfire? It was like 100-year-old transformer, or switchgear that failed at the site, 100-year-old piece. So yes, when we thought the road to Shangri-La was to spend all our money on new transmission and to build wind and solar, we lost our eye off reliability ball on steady grids. So yes, our whole team is trying to have a large pivot in where dollars are invested. With the goal should be we want the most reliable, most affordable electricity for Americans. That's what drove electricity policy for 100 years. And then we got off track 15 years ago, and we don't focus on that. We just focus on we're going to decarbonize our electricity grid by building wind and solar. It doesn't work, but it makes electricity more expensive. It makes the grid less reliable.
James Rosen with Newsmax. Thank you all for making yourselves available. I ask out of genuine interest first, where did your mom go to high school?
My mom went to high school in Mattapoisett in Massachusetts. They still have oil generation there. The rest of the country went beyond it.
Less directly focused on the subject at hand, actually, but adjacent. I remember when it was quite the thing to be discussing the security of our electrical grid system around the United States, and I wonder if you could assess for us the state of the security when you came into office, what you inherited from the Biden administration, and what you've been doing about that, and where we're at in that process of securing the grids.
Even better than my answer, much better than my answer, I'm going to turn it over to our acting Undersecretary for Energy, who is focused on cybersecurity, threats on the grid, and what he's doing, Alex Fitzsimmons.
You could begin by telling us where your mom went.
High school as well.
She went to White Plains, New York, by the way, another region that's gone off track from an energy policy standpoint. Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Deputies. It's a great question. I think what President Trump recognized is that he declared a national energy emergency on day one of the administration due to the disastrous energy subtraction policies that, as we know, resulted in skyrocketing electricity prices 20 to 30% or more in many parts of the country. We also now had, under those policies, a less reliable and less secure energy system in addition to a more expensive one. And so the Trump administration's been focused on rapidly reversing that, and part of it is listening to the advice of the nonpartisan grid operators that have to keep the lights on and manage the energy system day in and day out. They have been warning us for years that the premature retirement of reliable, dispatchable, secure generation has resulted in shrinking reserve margins, resource adequacy all across the country, and skyrocketing electricity prices at just the time when we need to be building more energy, not less. So we published a study last year that found on the course that we were on under the previous administration, we were set to lose 100 gigawatts of reliable dispatchable generation by 2030. At the same time, we might have to build 100 gigawatts. That would have resulted in 100 times more power outages, 100 times, not percent, times more power outages by 2030. We know that. Our foreign adversaries also know that. And so nation-state threat actors have been pre-positioning inside our critical energy infrastructure, especially defense-critical energy infrastructure, all across the country for years. Those efforts have only intensified as the threat landscape has increased, as we've seen more distributed energy resources from a installed capacity standpoint, not necessarily electricity generation. So the attack surface from a foreign adversary standpoint has expanded dramatically. Even though at the same time we're shutting down reliable power, we're replacing it with non-dispatchable generation that, as the Secretary pointed out, doesn't show up to meet peak demand and expands the attack surface. And so that threat landscape is constantly evolving. It's why the Trump administration has been completely focused on the most affordable, reliable, and secure energy system that we can build for the American people.
Oops. Hey, thanks so much, Brad Plumer with the New York Times. So in addition to the efforts to keep coal plants open, I saw that DOE has a couple funding announcements for trying to recommission and restart old coal plants. Curious what sort of interest you're seeing there and what the potential is for that. Is that to, take coal plants that have recently retired and try to, fix them up so they can start again? Is that to try to build new plants? What's your sort of thinking on that?
Well, as you saw, that the funding was relatively modest, nowhere near the amount to build a single coal plant. So what that counts on is, of course, co-funding, which is what we want from businesses that are there. But the interest in that's actually been pretty high. There are coal plants that are converting to natural gas that are thinking, hey, maybe we'll add natural gas instead of convert to natural gas. We'll keep our coal plant open and we'll upgrade it a little bit and we'll add natural gas. There are a couple areas in the U.S. I won't call them out that are looking at building new coal plants as well. And so we're welcoming anyone, but we believe in businesses. So we're not going to dictate what that is, but we've actually seen quite a number of inquiries. And so now there's a little bit of a competition about, where those funds will be allocated and how they'll be used. Thanks for the question.
Thanks. Secretary Tim Gardner from Reuters. Wanted to follow up on Carlos's question about Constitution. You mentioned that you believe the administration will win the battle, the political battle on that. How are you going about that, and what tools do you have to do that?
Yeah, well, ultimately, we'll reach out more to the public, starting with what it is right here today. And Alex mentioned nonpartisan studies, just professional people in the electricity world. There is a board over the New York electricity system as well that writes periodic reports about the outlook for stability and security of the grid going forward. And New York report was pretty alarming. And it both said that the grid security is a risk going forward, meaning supply able to meet demand. And it highlighted maybe its number one point, the need for more natural gas in New York. In New York, Constitution Pipeline would deliver gas to New York as well as all 6 New England states. What's the largest source of electricity generation in New York State today? By far, natural gas. Natural gas is 50% of New York's generation. It's over 50% of Virginia's generation. And then in nuclear, and then in New York, it's nuclear and hydro. Those are over 90% of New York. That's where they get electricity today. Yet they're passing laws in New York City that you can't have a natural gas heating or stove in your new building. Like this is batshit crazy. What's going to happen when you don't do that? When you don't allow a burner or a heater in a building in New York City, it's going to get its heating from electricity, which means you're going to burn natural gas at a plant. You'll have some waste heat. You're going to pay for the transmission lines and deliver natural gas heating at 3 to 4 times more expensive. Just passing laws that sound virtuous or somehow sound like you're a climate warrior. It's just crazy stuff that's going on. And Constitution Pipeline's a perfect example of that. What does New York grid need? Gas. That's what their own operators say. They need gas. The cheapest gas on the planet is in Pennsylvania. It happens to border New York. In fact, the even cheaper gas is right under the state of New York, the Marcellus shale gas. Like this is just trying to bring a focus back on humans. What has been the biggest source of decarbonization in the United States and globally? If that's your big issue, to me it's an issue, but it's nowhere near a big issue. The biggest source of decarbonization by far is natural gas. So these aren't climate policies. These aren't math policies. These are crazy. And I think the people of New York and the people of New England are going to say enough is enough. And everyone we've engaged with Democrats, Republicans, whatever, in a sober dialogue about energy, everyone comes to the same conclusion. Yeah, we need the Constitution Pipeline. I think there's pretty broad acceptance of that. But if you have one blocker, that's still a problem. But again, Tim, I believe we will win.
Hi, it's Ari Nader from Bloomberg. First of all, let me say thank you for streamlining the entry process, so it's not like going through airport security to get up here. I wanted to ask you about your upcoming trip to Venezuela, what you hope to achieve by going there, who you're going to meet with besides Delcy Rodriguez.
So, today's about electricity, but yes, I will be going to Venezuela before too long. I will meet with all the leadership in the country there and get a better understanding of the on-the-ground oil and gas production operations. I believe we are early on a very creative initiative of President Trump that can pivot the trajectory of a country that's been sliding downhill for 26 years to deliver improvement, meaningful improvements in the quality of life for Venezuelans without a single American boot on the ground, without shots being fired. This is using commerce and energy as opposed to conflict to resolve a problem. We're early on, but quite optimistic about the trajectory we're headed on.
Electricity question. Has PJM indicated support for the emergency auction that President Trump wants?
PJM is going through its stakeholder process and internal deliberations. We're talking to them all the time. When you say, are they expressing enthusiasm for it, or whatever word you used, they're in the middle of a crisis at PJM because of years of really bad policies and a insufficiency of generation going forward. I do think there is a broad recognition among the stakeholders, not necessarily agreement about a specific outcome, that something has to be done because the auctions have failed over time to procure the capacity necessary. So something is going to be coming imminently out of PJM, I'm certain, because they have to. But as to what exactly it is, ultimately we don't know. But everybody recognizes that there's a problem.
Hi, thank you. Sylvia with GovCIO Media and Research. I was just wondering if you could pull on the thread a little bit more about cybersecurity and the critical infrastructure that comes, after storms a couple years ago. There was copper stolen out of copper pipes in a school in Baltimore. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the critical infrastructure and cybersecurity part. Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's obviously an incredibly important topic. As I mentioned, we take the reliability and security of the energy system seriously because, as the Secretary has pointed out, when supply doesn't meet demand and people lose power, lives can be lost. And so it is our absolute responsibility to keep the lights on and have the most secure energy system possible. As I mentioned, nation-state threat actors are pre-positioning inside our critical infrastructure. This is publicly available information. They want to hold our critical infrastructure at risk for a time and place of their choosing. The attack surface is expanding. I think fortunately we have very strong partnerships with the energy sector. As James mentioned, we closely coordinate with them, both on storm response efforts like for Winter Storm Fern, but also for security and cybersecurity issues in general, and not just cybersecurity, but also physical security. So through the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, we have meetings routinely. We co-fund a lot of activities to identify what the most significant threats are to the energy system. I think our fundamental responsibility is to provide timely and actionable information to the energy sector. We do that with one program we have that's called the Energy Threat Analysis Center, where we co-locate with cleared industry partners and DOE staff. We have access to classified information. 80% of the energy system is actually owned and operated by the private sector that would not routinely have access to classified information. So we know what the threat information is. Our job is to get it into the hands of the private sector as rapidly and in an actionable way as we can. And so that's what we do. We have those partnerships. We figure out what the vulnerabilities are and then try to mitigate them. We also have major supply chain testing programs where we're able to procure grid components, which is increasingly important because of all of the energy infrastructure we have to build over the next few years to win the AI race and meet future load growth and onshore manufacturing. So we have a supply chain testing program where we can procure grid components, tear them apart, see what the cyber vulnerabilities are, mitigate them, and get that back out to the private sector. That's one of our top priorities here in the Trump administration.
Ivan Penn with the New York Times. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for taking the time. Obviously, we're increasingly seeing peaks during the winter, but our traditional and ongoing peak is during the summer. What do you say to the differences in what we experience in the East, like during the winter, versus what we experience in the West, where we have stronger wind and solar resources? What do you say to the difference in the benefit of wind and solar in some parts of the country that may not be as strong a resource in other parts of the country?
Yeah, look, everything in energy involves trade-offs. So are there locations where solar is a better application? Absolutely. You know, in a desert west, but still the fundamental problem for solar is the sun doesn't always shine. So you have to have a system, whether it's from storage or some novel way, that you can bring that energy when it's actually needed. And Ivan, well, two of the comments. One is peak demand for energy is always in the winter, by far. Peak demand for electricity is sometimes and often in the summer, because the biggest use of energy in people's households by far is heating. Like that winter storm we just went through, we're talking about the electricity grid. The natural gas distribution network going into people's homes and houses was delivering 4 times more energy than the electricity grid was at its maximum stress. So it's just that the biggest use of energy in most places is not done electrically, which is also why it's crazy. There's these policies that are sold as green or climate that really just should be sold as, innumerate, that we're going to drive heating to electric thing because people think that's green or better. It just means more expensive, and we don't have an electricity grid that can remotely handle moving all heating or even a meaningful amount of heating to electricity, which is why you're seeing more peak demand. You're seeing peak demand for electricity shift to the winter is just a little bit of shift to electricity using for heating instead of burning natural gas. That if we just had a few more percent of Americans shift their heating to electric instead of natural gas, all the electricity peaks would be in the wintertime. And one last contact on wind and solar, because you're right, it's different in different places and all that. But the world just roughly has spent $10 trillion on wind, solar, batteries, and transmission to hook up wind, solar, and batteries. And the last full year of data, 2.6% of global energy. 1.2% of global primary energy comes from solar, 1.4% from wind. $10 trillion. And that's the easy 2.5%. The next 2.5%, the next are much harder as you get higher penetrations in just one sector, the electricity sector.
All right, we're going to do one more question.
Thank you. Audrey Streb, Daily Caller. Thank you all for being here today and addressing us. So former FERC Chairman Mark Christie described the DOE direction to FERC to draft new rules asserting federal control over how data centers connect to the grid as a massive federal power grab. I was wondering how you respond to this concern, and then how the DOE can balance the AI race, the national competitiveness where it comes to that, and state sovereignty, as well as stabilizing the grid.
So I'm gonna turn the hard part of the question over to Deputy Secretary James Danley. But I will say that the overwhelming reaction we got to that was thanks for a little return to common sense. We need to be able to do this stuff. Why have we had no electricity increase in our capacity to produce electricity over the last 20 years? We've been in a regulatory quagmire. China produces like 2 or 3 times as much electricity as we do today. They produce less than us like 20 years ago. We've just stagnated, and they've grown and they've invested. So, but I'll turn over for a more technical answer to the more knowledgeable Secretary Danley.
Yeah. So I'm well aware of what Commissioner Christie said. He, of course, was a colleague of mine for years on the commission. This is a case where I don't agree with him. To the extent to which any petition filed by the Secretary sounds in the fundamental question of interstate transmission, that is a federal jurisdictional activity. The states and the feds have a completely separated jurisdiction under the Federal Power Act. It is unambiguous, and the 403 that the Secretary sent to the Commission explicitly stated that it was not attempting to enter state jurisdiction, that this was purely a matter regarding FERC's tariffs that administrate interconnection to the transmission system. And so if you read the plain terms of that 403, it does not contemplate that, because the jurisdictional lines are unambiguous and have been maintained since the Federal Power Act was passed a century ago.
I'd love to end by thanking everyone in this room, working the cameras, the reporters, asking the questions. Like, energy is just this fundamental thing to human quality of life, to the future of our economy, to our national security. It's complicated, and it's not understood by many people. All of you dedicating your time to learn about energy, to ask questions, to write about energy, that's the only way forward, is a broader understanding of the energy issues. So thank you for your commitment to doing that, and thank you for being here today. All the questions were great, and I wish we could take 10 more. But thank you all so much.